Hello, everybody. We will all introduce ourselves. We're each going to talk a little bit, and then we would love to just have a conversation with you because you're the smart CLT people who have a lot of answers to a lot of questions that we have, and we're just going to kind of go from there. Hi, I am Erika Hennebury. I am a senior cultural affairs officer with the City of Toronto. My background is in arts and culture. I've only moved into planning sort of later in my career, and I'm opening for the City of Toronto a new office for cultural space, and we're really focused on trying to retain and preserve arts and culture space, but also do a better job of helping community to develop arts and culture space. So let me just also hand it over to our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. Brian, do you want to go first?
I don't know if it's working. Yeah, sure. My name is Brian McBay. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm one of the people who came from Vancouver. So we feel like we had a big party last night, but we didn't, of course. My background, I come from the arts sector. I actually went to design school and then art school, and at the age of 18, as a student, started an organization I'm going to talk about today. So it's been 18 years since then, so I have a few things to say, but maybe I'll pass it from there. I don't know how long of an intro you really want.
Oh, just like basic intro, and then when you get up here, you can do your full.
Sure.
Tell us everything.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I'm from the Community and Cultural Spaces Land Trust in downtown Toronto. I'm the chair of the board there right now. Our trust is the grateful benefactor of a community benefit settlement that was negotiated by really amazing group of residents in the Bloor-Dufferin neighborhood, and we'll be using those funds to hopefully acquire and sustain arts and culture spaces. My background is an urban planner, and I've mostly worked in community benefits, negotiations, and affordable housing development.
Hey, my name is Jonathan Bunce. I am a Toronto-based writer, musician, concert presenter, and now researcher. I founded a nonprofit organization called Wavelength Music. Some people know me as Johnny Dovercourt. I wrote a book about the history of the Toronto music scene called Any Night of the Week, and I recently co-authored a study called Reimagining Music Venues with Dan Silver at U of T, which I'll tell you about shortly. I want to shout out my sister, Susanna Bunce, who I learned all about community land trusts from.
My name is Jessa Agilo. I am the founder of ArtsPond Étendard, a strange kind of arts and social change caregiving organization. I've been in the arts sector my entire life, 35 years in the sector, as a creator, as a producer, as a manager, and now as a change maker and a caregiver. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing to establish a cultural land trust in the region called Ground Trust. So hear more about that soon. Lovely
Amazing.
To be here.
Thank you, everybody. We're basically at the sort of very beginning in Canada of setting up cultural land trusts. They're a new thing. They're really evolving from the CLT model. There are a couple of CLTs in the States, and there's one in the UK that are focused on arts and culture. So I'm just gonna set the context just like a little bit. I'm gonna just talk tiny bit about each of these little other CLTs that already exist, and then we're going to talk about our emerging CLTs and sort of how to support them and what they need, and talk about some of the technical and mechanical things. I also want to shout out Carmen May, who's here from 221A, who's amazing. Acquisition and R&D for 221A, is that? Cultural Spaces, okay. She also can answer questions. Okay. So I'm just gonna read a little bit of this sort of intro, and then I'm gonna hand it to Brian, and then each of these presenters will present, and then we'll have a conversation. So CLTs have really become largely synonymous with housing, and they're seeing an unprecedented growth. growth. And this session is going to explore cultural CLTs as an emerging anti-displacement model for artists and arts organizations. Today we're focused specifically on art space, but I also want to acknowledge the work of emerging cultural-focused CLTs in Toronto that are working on resisting cultural gentrification and displacement. So that includes Toronto Indigenous Land Trust and 2 new Black-led, Black-serving CLTs in Little Jamaica and Chinatown CLT as well. These groups are really looking to rematriate land, and they're working on reparations and this really, really important work. So I just want to kind of put that out there. But we are going to focus just on our art space today. So the COVID-19 pandemic subjected the cultural sector to what Andy Pratt calls a cultural heart attack. The pandemic triggered mass layoffs, cancellations, closures of venues, and at the same time, the cultural sector was really being eviscerated. Artists were more and more being called on to, help bring people together and connect people and keep us going all through the pandemic. So it was really, really clear how important the arts were to all of our lives, especially those of us who binged Netflix for pretty much all of 2020. Definitely me, because artists made those shows too. And meanwhile, the loss of arts and cultural spaces has been really devastating to the arts and culture sector, and it really has set us back like an entire generation. We have lost so many spaces. We really need to do everything we can to develop more spaces, and CLT is a great model. So artists are often thought of as first wave gentrifiers, pioneers of gentrification, and indeed that can be true. We can be complicit with gentrification, but we're also kind of on the front lines of anti-gentrification and anti-displacement movements and fighting evictions. And many, many of the CLTs are actually led by artists, and we might not always remember that, but I want to just shout out that Josh Barnt is an artist, Dominic Russell is an artist, Kevin Barrett is an artist. My new friends, Bryn and Nike Vic at Crow's Common CLT in Nova Scotia are artists. Hania Cheng from Chinatown CLT, these people are all artists, and these people on the stage today are also all artists. So it's very much an artist-led movement in many ways. So it makes sense for us to really think and take care to address cultural spaces through CLTs. So CLTs can offer the possibility of embedding local arts and cultural spaces without triggering displacement by ensuring that community is in control, by ensuring that affordability is prioritized through democratic governance, and then also the CLTs provide arts education and local community programming. So there are many, many reasons for folks who have CLTs to consider arts and culture spaces within their CLTs, and for artists to try to develop CLTs. So they can really anchor a community infrastructure in neighborhoods without triggering displacement. So there are some new CLTs. There are some CLT adjacent entities that I kind of want to point out that are also really interesting and do serve a really important role as well. So I want to just shout out a couple of precedents, and one is that folks probably here know is Community Arts Stabilization Trust in San Francisco, CAST. CAST is not a CLT, but they are a community-centered real estate organization. They were developed through a partnership, through a couple of foundations. They're very much sector-led. The goal, though, is to graduate assets to nonprofit ownership. It's not to retain those assets in perpetuity. So in that way, it is not necessarily a CLT. Then there's Seattle Space Agency, also not a CLT, but they are a mission-driven, values-based cultural real estate development company. They are chartered by the city of Seattle. Then there's Creative Land Trust in London, England. That was established by the mayor of London, actually. So that's also kind of a top-down sector-led project. And it was established by philanthropists as well. And the real goal is to provide space for studio providers. In London, there are 250 studio providers. In Toronto, there are 2. So there's just a completely different environment over there. And the need for affordability for studio providers is incredibly important. So the CLT serves to hold land and rents it to the studio providers, but there is no community membership, and there are no artists on the board of directors. These are real estate professionals and finance investors. So this is not a community-run organization. So in that way, this is not a community land trust. A brand new tiny baby real community land trust that is artist-led has been born like a couple of months ago through the Northern California Land Trust, which is also an artist-led land trust. It's being led by Meg Schiffler, and the focus is really on caring for aging boomer artists so that they can stay in their homes, because oftentimes the boomer generation of artists manage somehow to buy space and buy land, but we're not able to really sustain it over time. And so sometimes their housing is kind of falling apart and they not really have great access to healthcare. So the CLT will actually care for them in their older years. And then they will bequest their housing to the CLT that will then provide it to a future generation. So this is like a stunning new model that I just heard about, and I think it's gorgeous. So those are kind of the models that we have. Those are the precedents that we have. And then we have the stage of people who are creating the Canadian precedents, like kind of as we speak. So we really want to hear from them today. So I'm going to invite Brian to come up first. And your slides are there. After you're done, I don't know what's going to happen.
That's okay. Thanks so much, Erika, and everyone. I'm just going to share a little bit about where we're at over in BC with the creation of a cultural land trust. So first I'll give a little bit of background on myself. I'm told I only have 5 minutes, so please shut me down. Of course, our intention is to have collective ownership of arts and culture properties in British Columbia. And first I just want to give a bit of my own background. This is, I'm the small child there. There's my grandfather. He was a baker in Chinatown. We had a restaurant from 1941 to 1993, and he was born in Canada so he could speak English, and so had a big part in organizing, whether he liked it or not. This is 221A, and first I'll just give a bit of backstory, which is 221A is where I work. I'm actually the executive director of 221A, and we're a nonprofit society. We operate 115 artist studios and 30 units of housing. I know the Community Land Trust of BC is here, and they're actually our landlord for those 30 units of housing, so a lot of overlap. This is a building in Chinatown. We opened in 2008. We were still students then, and it was a very standard model of artists, what artists typically do, which is they take a building, they use it as artist studios, and then maybe they'll carve out a section of it for an art gallery or some kind of presentation space. They use the total rental that's all the artists are paying, and that'll augment the cost of that front space, but they won't necessarily last that long. After a few years, people go and do things, go overseas or whatever, and then that's the end of it. It was 2008, which was the economic crisis, and there was not really any funding. There was not really any private funding, and our rent went up. We're like, what? How is this possible? The whole world's collapsing, but our rent goes up. So at the same time, we noticed across the street, and this is all in Chinatown, I should say, so there's some connections to my family, at 222 East Georgia. There was a large kind of warehouse, and you notice in a lot of Chinatowns, a storefront connected to a warehouse, because there was a mixed industrial and then storefront, and usually even living spaces in the same building, which is quite unique. And they had a for lease sign, and it turned out it was a Chinese Benevolent Association. And that Chinese Benevolent Association, they're called the Yifeng Toy Society of Canada, and they actually have 5 chapters in Canada, and they own the property. And so made up of mostly people that are 90 plus, 80 plus in age, and my family was a little bit involved. So when we found this lease, I actually brought my grandmother with us, and we had the intention of saying, what if we moved all of our artist studios to this building, which is much bigger, and then we used our space, our initial space, as a bigger art space for us. And it helped to separate some of those challenges of how we manage the space, but it also forced us into a little bit more maturity, I guess you might say, and we started getting to know government funding. And so the Chinese Benevolent Associations actually have been in operation in Chinatown for many, many decades, and they mostly came out of de facto segregation. They purchased their properties, they did housing, they did jobs, they had local economy, and then culture also blossomed. Tasty food, and even today, you look at Chinatowns around North America, and you see that history of that social sustainability. So how do we bring that forward? And so we've actually just started working on a 9-story project. It's all social housing or low-income housing in Chinatown with the Yis, with the idea we'll take a 99-year lease and work on the development side of it and build out housing for both the Chinese seniors as well as for artists. So you have this unique collaboration between different generations of Chinese Canadians, but also more kind of open and contemporary in terms of different intersectional cultures. So this is just kind of a bit of eye candy of what it could look like. And you know, with 221A over the years, this is kind of a big jump to the present. We ended up getting involved in more and more projects. Now we're involved in 9 different properties in the city. And most recently, we just opened a 7-story building downtown. And it's a beautiful building. It's a 60-year lease with the city of Vancouver. We don't pay rent, we don't pay property taxes. And we're able to provide studios with artists with long-term access to space. So it's, in a way, it's like a home run, you might think, from the perspective of what a municipality can do. But we started asking ourselves, what's the succession model beyond these kind of leasing structures? Is there an opportunity for us to use the assets to try to secure more and more arts organizations out there, and also at the same time try to provide self-determination to a lot of those nonprofit groups? And one thing we noticed right away about our leasehold model was that we have, I just realized I can look at the screen here, exposure to the speculative market at usually lease turnovers. So a 60-year lease, that's pretty far away. This goes till 2082, I think. So none of us will, well, maybe some of us will be around, but a lot of us won't be. But a lot of our leases are only 10, 20 years. So at those points, we have to negotiate on behalf of our multiple tenants for what that lease rate is going to be. Then we're also limited to borrow. Even the city of Vancouver won't allow us to encumber this building with the debt, at least at this point. And you know, being debt-free has served us, actually, so it's a good thing. But there is some benefits to having an asset layer where different properties can be owned on a portfolio, and you can take on some degree of debt in order to try to accelerate purchasing more and more property to protect it. One thing I'll say is in 2010, during the Olympics, we saw a huge amount of closures of space, and so we know that this building took 10 years, and a couple other buildings took 10 years for the development to happen. At the same time, we lost many, many hundreds of buildings. So the other thing is the architectural form itself, and this goes back to self-determination. So a lot of the buildings we get involved with are large developments. Basically, they're market developments that have a portion of it that's a community amenity contribution. So it's government has negotiated increased density for us to access a unit, basically on behalf of the community for low-income benefit. And we find that cultural groups, especially ethno-cultural groups who have, let's say it took 3 decades for this restaurant to have a soul in this community, and people to gather around it, you know, you have the right kind of situation happening. When you don't have that security of tenure, you lose those spaces, but also how can we get to the point of actually creating architecture, being a part of the development process as groups of artists, and making it so the city is more a poetic place, more a place that you want to be in. It's not just about square footage, and that's where I think arts and culture has a very particular angle into what we can do in the land trust movement, and if anyone wants to partner with us, of course, we'll make your buildings beautiful. Lastly is the operational complexity. 221A would be described as an operator. We operate all these spaces, and it's complicated. We have tenants who are going through major challenges in their own lives, and that alone means that we have to focus quite a bit on what happens in those spaces. And you see, even at times, the business models aren't necessarily sustainable, and that puts pressure on the assets. Sometimes you have to borrow against the asset to cover the operations. By splitting assets from our operations, we know that it creates it de-risks the whole model a little bit in case you've taken too much risk on an operating situation. So you keep those sort of back to the landlock. You try to keep those assets for many years. Okay, I'll try to speed up. This is an example of, since 2017, we've lost 400 art spaces, and this is mostly the downtown east side area, but where a congregation of most of the artists are. So you can see the larger circles there is about 50 to 200 artists. And over 80% of them are actually in areas where the zoning is significantly higher in terms of density than what they're occupying. So they're occupying one-story building and it's zoned for a new tower. So it's very likely that these will all be displaced. We know also from the City of Vancouver's data that 2/3 of spaces are in under 5 years. So, and 1/3 is about 5 years. 2 organizations own their spaces. So most of the big ones are covered by being in City of Vancouver buildings, but the small and medium-sized ones, the ones in your neighborhoods, those are all going. Lastly, we also know that Indigenous artists, Black and racialized artists make significantly less money than artists, and artists already make significantly less money than most workers. So the focus on low income and embracing low income as an understanding of the difference between creative class or creative economy and actually what artists and nonprofits are supporting our community. There's a racialized artist there. So we're looking to land trust. I'm going to try to wrap up now because you've went over some of these case studies already, but we found 4 particular pillars was required for the creation of a cultural land trust. We did a literature review, looked at 20 or 30 other community land trusts, very few of them actually involved in culture, but we found that all of them were responding to low-income affordability crisis. That all of them were involved with freehold ownership, although that's not always the case, it's almost always the case in other jurisdictions. They all had seed funding of some kind, and they had community-led governance. So whoever is reputable in your community, as well as people in the tenant base, are actually involved in the governance. So we found that there's an opportunity by creating a cultural land trust to actually work to decommodify land, and one of the biggest sells for municipal government, since we have the City of Toronto here, is the ability to leverage investment. Yes, it's very good that you can rezone zone a developer and force them to provide benefits, but the senior governments aren't at the table, right? They should be paying as well. And what can we do? We can't respond to 400 venues closing with one building. We need to move faster. As I went over community self-determination, reconciliation and equity, and that we can build in our governance structure Indigenous, Black, racialized folks, queer people, in both the governance as well as in the trust assets. You can have a layer of funding that supports specifically those trust assets as well. And lastly, in regulation and capacity. So this is my sell to all of the funders out there who keep getting calls from people, and then the funders send them to me and say, you should talk to Brian, because they're running out of options for what to do with the rent, is we can help with talking about property taxes, talking about other major regulatory issues in the provincial level and the city. And that's it. I'll hand it over.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's so incredible the work that you all are doing and the knowledge that you hold, and it's just like, I appreciate you passing it on to us and also, being available for us to ask you questions, because we will. Jessa's a technical wizard, in case you didn't know. She's just brilliant at computer things.
There should be a button
among
here.
many other things.
I'm not sure which one.
I don't know the button to make it.
We can have technical assistance, please. It's probably this one.
You're going to press one button and blow our minds, I bet.
Is it
It's
that?
probably that one. Is that
So
one?
we just want to go
We want to change.
Escape.
do this.
Yeah.
And then, there we go.
Okay.
Okay,
but
so
I'm
we
not
just
sure
need
which
to
one it is.
pop
It's
up the
We need the
ArtsPond
we
one.
need the desktop. It's on the desktop. Is that where you put it? On the desktop.
There it is.
This one?
Yeah.
This one.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. And then right down there.
But I can't even see it.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Bonjour. Anin etelahai. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. So as the founder of ArtsPond Étendard, we're still in the conceptual stage of building out what we imagine as ground trust, a cultural land trust, and I will talk about that in a minute and the work that we're doing. But I'm sharing on screen here it's a work in progress. We're surprisingly celebrating our second decade or 10th anniversary next year, which is a real surprise. I didn't think we would get to this point, but this is some of the work that I'm currently doing to imagine all the accountabilities and responsibilities and commitments in language, because words matter in terms of our next decade in our strat plan. And we're shifting really to root ourselves in care, and care for whom, and care for what issues is the questions that I'm concerned with every day as an arts and social change and arts and systems change and social care organization. What are our priorities? What are we fighting for, and who is involved? Because the roots and the ripple effects of precarity and the drive, the dream of prosperity is really, really challenging to balance. We're often going, okay, there's a disaster to COVID-19. Like, I dropped everything that I was working on, and $350,000 of public money just went into the bank and said, okay, we're not spending that right now, we're gonna volunteer, and we created a mutual aid network with 7,500 people joined in like 2 weeks. So acting to disasters is a really important thing, but the daily needs for survival and our dreams and the doulas that we need to achieve, the support that we need to help us achieve our dreams, we need to invest in those people as well. So it's a balance to, okay, are we looking at pure survival? Are we looking at thriving? And precarity and prosperity are, these kind of four quadrants are a real challenge to balance. And trying to break out of that kind of opposition between, okay, you're surviving or thriving, or you're in precarity or in your prosperity. How can we think differently about that? And so we want to invest in groups of fives. We call it, this is the model that I'm working on. I don't have an official name for it, but I call it the fives. And I put some of them here where we're thinking about rooted in care, that there is care seekers and services that can be offered, should be offered to care seekers. And then there's caretakers, which is an organization maybe like myself that we're working on, where you're rooted in support as an intermediary between those that are seeking support and those that are ready and willing and have capacity and interest to give support. So there's lots of social purpose organizations that are out there as caregivers rather than caretakers. And then more along where the work that we're doing is shifting towards care making and care shaping rather than change making, thinking about social change and social innovation and systems innovation models, not just in terms of space. So we're intersectional roots of precarity in the sector. We're interested in digital, we're interested in disability and economic issues, we're interested in social and spatial concerns in the sector. So we're actually building a platform cooperative, which, if you're familiar with the digital space at all, is and building a software platform that's open source, where we have a mutual aid network around the effects of the pandemic, which helped, I'm quite proud to say that we helped make CERB be inclusive of gig workers, not just in the art sector, but during the pandemic to increase the support of the sector. So kind of looking at the real harms and the annoyances and hindrances in the community, and then trying to hack those kind of preconceptions and offering help and trying to harmonize the help that's available in the sector. So that's a little bit here, looking at our real life, our virtual lives, our natural lives in the natural world, as well as our dream life and our ancestral life in terms of the indigenous peoples, talking about 7 generations, that the work that we're doing now in terms of thinking about the language we use and what we're fighting for, there's a real commitment, I think, that when we think about our 7 generations behind us and 7 generations ahead of us. That's kind of some of the work that we're doing right now in terms of thinking about our model. And this is a much older older graphic from 2019, which demonstrates the interconnectedness in a very complicated diagram, but the interconnectedness between two projects. The first is really the community engagement work, the research that we did in a project called Ground Story. It was the first arts project that was supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Fund, which is no longer existent. And it's there where we were asking questions like, what the heck is gentrification and its impacts on the sector in terms of storytelling, and trying to come to a sense of accountability, because we're often blamed in the arts sector for gentrification. So what is our story and what is our ownership in terms of living on the ground? And from there, we came to the decision to focus on establishing a cultural land trust, and the working title is Ground Trust. And we intentionally choose the word ground rather than land because of the spirit of both being feeling grounded, and that personal connection to our bodies and our spirits, as well as the land itself. I'm kind of inspired as an organization by the idea of water, and like we're all beings of water, and there's air and land and earth and fire, but the one thing that doesn't really get speculated on, other than offering very poor care of water in Indigenous communities in terms of clean water, but the one that isn't invested in so much is water. And why can't we treat land the way we do water, where water is a guaranteed resource in all of our homes, right? So why can't we do the same for our homes and our land? So we're currently doing a feasibility study that I can talk about briefly. There are two components to that feasibility study. One is a social finance strategy and a literacy education piece for the sector, because the arts and culture sector really doesn't understand what the heck social finance is and what impact investing is and what community bonds are, even though there's really good precedents in the sector, such as CSI, that we've all been watching. The art sector really isn't prepared. There's maybe 10 people that I know in all of Toronto that would be ready to take on a social finance project. So we're not just building a social finance strategy for the land trust that we want to establish, but also doing literacy for the sector to understand the opportunities. And then the second component is a capital acquisition, development, redevelopment strategy. And I'll just mention our priorities. So there's a real big challenge in the cultural sector around funding, and there's restrictions there's funding available for housing, there's funding available for what we call workspaces, so exhibition galleries and performance halls. But they're in two pools, and we need to combine them. We need to have like single properties that have live-work condos in the upper levels, and then public-facing spaces on the ground and in the basement. And we don't have funding that will support that. So we have funding for a feasibility study that is for workspaces, presentation, exhibition, performance spaces only, and not live workspaces, which is, I think, the real need in the sector is live workspaces for gig workers, which is what I am, and that's our priority as an organization. So we're pigeonholed before we even get started in terms of funding in the sector and thinking strategically and deeply about what is needed. And that's a real challenge, but also a real opportunity for thinking differently in the future. So we are currently, our feasibility study, last thing I'll mention is we're looking at a couple of different case studies. There's been, and we're gonna hear more from Johnny around live music venues. There's been a lot of loss of commercial spaces, so doing some case studies around trying to save some live music venues. We're looking at, with Artscape, if you've heard about the receivership, I'm actually an owner in the Artscape Triangle loss. So looking at trying to potentially save some of the Artscape spaces, particularly Young Place. In the arts sector here in Toronto, if you know the Toronto Media Arts Centre is also another space that is, we need to do something. So we're looking at that as a case study. And we're also looking outside Toronto. Brampton, Hamilton, and other places for possibilities there. And that's another issue is, municipalities not being connected in terms of funding opportunities and priorities around policy development and support of land trusts. So it's not a blame to the city at all, but to Toronto at all and what Erika and the mayor are trying to do. But when we want to work here in Toronto and Hamilton, then Toronto only wants to fund Toronto and Hamilton only wants to fund Hamilton. But there's not enough people who have the skills, capacity, and interest to lead the development of a new land trust in culture. So we need a culture-based CLT to incubate the new land trust. So we need someone here in the region that's looking at the golden horseshoe more broadly in terms of capacity building, research, and staffing, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're also challenged in looking at regional priorities for funding. And I'll end my thoughts there and look forward to hearing everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessa. I really appreciate that. One thing I just love about Jessa is that she's this broad thinker and she's always coming up with these genius new ideas, and it's so great. So thank you so much. Hannah. Hannah's amazing. If you ever want to know anything about infrastructure, she's your call. Hannah's going to talk about Community and Cultural Spaces Trust.
Yeah.
Voila.
I don't know if I can pull our website up. You have to forgive me, I didn't put a presentation together. I have to make about 15 PowerPoints a week for my job, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it, guys. And maybe while we're trying to find the web browser, I'll issue a minor correction that I'm not an artist, but don't worry, everybody else on the board is. And I was raised by artists, and you can trust me. But I am a dry, boring, operational, process-oriented governance buzzkill. But I really listen to my colleagues, I swear.
That's literally what happens is 5 artists gather around the laptop. What do we do? We're all trying to figure it out together.
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Get the stage manager, please.
How do I? Oh my gosh,
are you looking for?
embarrassing.
What
Yeah,
are you looking for?
I would like to find my website.
Oh.
And while we are doing that, thank you so much. I think I'm going to focus a bit on the origin of the group. We're in a really unique position where we have I'm just humiliating myself right now. Yes. We're in a really unique position where we kind of have the opposite problem as our peers, which is that we have the golden goose, we have an opportunity, we have some money, but we actually have to build an institution around that. And usually for most people it goes the other way, where they start with an institution, they start with a space, they start with an organization and a really specific concept, and then they chase that opportunity. And not complaining about the position we're in, but it's a really different process. And so I just wanted to focus initially on how this all came to be and really acknowledge the very important story of how we got this opportunity. So in November of 2019, after many years of community organizing and advocacy, residents won a historic $17 million community benefits settlement, and that was in response to redevelopment and a sale of public school lands at the southwest corner of Bloor and Dufferin Street. The activities were led by a volunteer community group called Build a Better Bloor Dufferin. Many community members supported this activity. Thousands of hours went into participating in the planning process, participating in the OLT process, working with local elected officials, and this is truly the result of a completely grassroots and community-led activity, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that as we're in our next generation of work, which is to put these fancy names on these institutions, like this kind of trust and that kind of trust, that this actually was a completely community-led activity. And so the proceeds of those settlements were put into 2 separate trusts. $15 million went into a affordable housing trust known as the Community Affordable Housing Solutions. It's kind of co-stewarded by St. Clair's Multi-Faith Housing and Habitat for Humanity, GTA. If you go on our website, you can find all the links to their spaces. And so they're well on their way. They have this kind of stewardship and this opportunity to live within an institution who's kind of guiding them and giving them the structures to start making decisions. And then $2 million went into our lovely and modest Community and Cultural Spaces Land Trust. And the reason that the community pursued those $2 million was in recognition of the fact that we know, very similar to what Brian described, that a lot of artists have historically lived in that part of the city, along with many other historical groups, and are getting displaced both from their housing and also from their art spaces, from production spaces, from performance spaces, from various institutions and spaces they need to support the work that they do. So this incredible group of community members kind of threw in a request at the 11th hour, is the legend I've been told, to see if they could squeak a little bit more out of the developer in this negotiation, and somehow miraculously secured $2 million. And now the question is, what do we do with it? How do we structure an institution around this? How do we structure an organization around this? How do we think about decision making and governance? And I guess that is how the boring person got on the board, is maybe to help them a little bit with figuring that part out. So in terms of our next steps, or what our mandate is, we kind of broadly defined the organization, having a mandate to create and facilitate sustainable processes for acquiring and maintaining real property for use by community, cultural, and arts organizations in the Bloor-Dufferin neighborhood. Why would we narrow it down now? We should just continue to keep it vague and make our jobs hard. And we are currently in the midst of a couple really important activities. We have recently done a recruitment to start building out our board. So right now we have a founding board that's made up of people who are involved in the Bloor-Dufferin, Build a Better Bloor-Dufferin group. We came together last year and actually incorporated the organization so we could start receiving the funds from the developer. It's coming in installments over several years, so we don't have all the money yet. Don't come running at us. We can't fully help you guys yet, but it's coming over time. And so after doing that and doing the basic work to actually receive the funds and be a formal enough institution for that, we started to put together a process earlier this year to recruit new board members, have some of my board members in the room, Arella, have some new steering committee members, Leisha, in the room, and we have a new little cohort of people to help us build out this work. And we're hoping over the next year to kind of continue to refine our foundational principles as an organization, to establish a framework for decision-making and governance for this asset. It's really complicated to think about how we respond to such a significant need with not taking for granted a chunk of money, but not a piece of money that solves the problem, right? So, we have to start having those really critical conversations, like how do we even think about priority? Is it people who are at the most risk of displacement tomorrow? Is it people who are the most historically disadvantaged in finding spaces? Is it the people who have the lowest inventory of the type of spaces in the community that we can generate an opportunity for them? It's really complicated to think about how we distribute equitably and from a community perspective, because that's where this money came from, how we distribute this opportunity. And I really try to maintain that point of view that this is ultimately a community asset that we just happen to have the incredible privilege to steward, and we can't make decisions in isolation or just based on our own priorities as a group of 9 people. We're going to do everything we can to really think bigger picture about what the needs across the community are and how we could involve them in that decision making. So we're also hoping over the next year to complete a needs assessment. We're working right now with a group of students from U of T, one of whom I ran into yesterday in the building, which was really lovely, who's starting to build out some of the tools we need to complete that needs assessment. And then hopefully in the future we'll get into acquisitions. But there's a lot of work to do to actually build out an institution that can make ethical, community-minded, and safe decisions for this public asset that we have. So great to talk to so many people this weekend and learn about some of those governance and operational opportunities. Obviously, that's what I'm interested in and who I connected with. I'm really excited to talk to you guys more about what the needs are in the community, which I know you understand so well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry in advance for calling you every single week for the next 3 to 5 years. So next we have Johnny Dovercourt, AKA Jonathan Bunce, or the other way around, who's an amazing arts leader and just like a good guy, and wrote this amazing report that you should all read. So hand it over.
Thanks, Erika. I think it's my turn for tech support.
Which one is it?
I think it's that one, yeah.
Ah, yes. Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry, I think I went too far. Oh, there is that now at the beginning.
That's the beginning.
Perfect. Oops.
Let's hit it. All right, we're up. Hey, I'm Johnny. Thanks for coming. Great to see some musicians in the house and familiar faces. What I'm going to talk about is very sort of hypothetical, conceptual, high level. For the last 2 years, I was working on co-authoring a study called Reimagining Music Venues that was published just about 3 weeks ago. Really interesting collaboration, sort of a hybrid academic and sectoral research project, collaboration between myself and Dan Silver, who's a professor of sociology at University of Toronto Scarborough and part of the School of Cities. We worked with 2 different student groups. It's great to see a couple of some members that contributed to the early phases of the research. I'm just going to go really quickly through talking about the study before getting into the fun CLT stuff. You can download the study, read it at Wavelength Music. At the end of the study of my hastily assembled PowerPoint, there's a QR code where you can download the 96-page study. Hopefully you've had a chance to absorb the exec summary. We did some really interesting data analysis. It was one component of the research. There was a few different components. There was data analysis, there was a big survey, there were stakeholder interviews, literature review. But really the kind of like the basis of this study was, what are the alternatives to the typical bar model? Like, for myself as a musician, I spent all my sort of formative years playing in these small clubs and bars that are mostly for-profit businesses that operate on a really razor-thin margin. And this is really in Ontario, the dominant model where you would hear live music is in small licensed clubs and bars, especially at that key emerging artist level, at the level that really incubates new music and develops new music scenes. Is the venues under 300 capacity that are usually driven by a business model based on alcohol sales. They sort of seem to be cultural centers, but they're really kind of, it just only informally so. Very few of these spaces have access to much in the way of public funding, and they're not sort of driven with any kind of explicit community mandate. And you've probably heard a lot about venues closing in Toronto and Ontario. By the way, our study was Ontario-wide because of it was funded by Ontario Creates, which made it really interesting because it was not just about Toronto. We looked at mostly Southern Ontario, but comparing what's happening here across the whole music ecosystem outside of, or the provincial music ecosystem outside of Toronto. And what we did was we were actually looking at we got some really interesting big data by getting concert listing sites to give us their listings data for up to a whole decade and look at the trends in concert activity. So there's a focus on venue closures, which we saw a lot of in the sort of late 2010s, especially in Toronto, but there was also new venues opening at the same time. So we wanted to actually see, like, what's the overall impact on concert activity? So we saw that it actually started to go down, especially in the late
late 2010s leading up to the pandemic. And we also saw, we did some really cool mapping and saw that especially in Toronto, there's a real geographic concentration of live music, especially in the downtown West End. And like 85% of all the concert activity in Toronto happens in this area, just sort of basically west of the Don Valley and south of the St. Clair Hill. So we also did the stakeholder survey, which had a great response. We had about 350 responses, which is huge for a music industry study. And we talked to the entire music ecosystem. We weren't just focused on venue operators. We talked to artists, we talked to presenters, and we also got the opinions of audience members, and really got their perception about the value of live music. And there was obviously, we all know the value of live music, but the results of the study really affirmed that music venues kind of are this quasi-public good. And there's also the perception that venues are threatened, inaccessible, and unsustainable. We heard from people about the barriers they felt accessing venues. And this really led to the key finding of the study, which is what we call this sort of market misalignment, which is essentially that artists think that they're not getting paid enough, audiences think they're paying too much in ticket prices, and venue operators think their costs are constantly rising. So basically, the whole economy for live music in Ontario is fundamentally broken. So coming out of this sort of negative assessment, we wanted to see sort of what's the alternative, and there was definitely an appetite for experimentation within the music ecosystem, a big hunger to see alternatives to the typical bar model. But people didn't want to see sort of techno-utopian solutions. They didn't know there wasn't much interest in virtual reality saving the day. People would really enjoy the traditional venue experience, but they want to see more of it, more options, more diversity, more accessible pricing, and for the environment to be healthy and clean. Good sound and clean bathrooms was a big theme. So we looked at sort of 5 new venue models, which were broken down into 3 categories. This is where we'll get to the good stuff. I would say that these aren't necessarily new models around the world. They're maybe sort of more uncommon in Ontario. The first 2 in the category was the idea of a stage truck, a mobile truck for live music, which one of the other groups of UT students created an amazing feasibility study for. The second was everywhere as a venue, the idea of creating more opportunities for live music to take place in public space, like this great presenter, Fort Elgin, who puts on shows in Hamilton in all kinds of strange places or unconventional places like beaches and greenhouses. The next 2 is the idea of offering more affordable space for innovation and community building within live music. Sort of 2 angles on that. One is the idea of live music within a multidisciplinary arts center, something which is very common in Europe, but strangely very rare in Ontario, with exceptions like Arts Court in Ottawa and the SAW Centre. And then music centers, more the idea of a music venue that's part of a bigger complex that might have other music-related uses, like rehearsal space, something that's very much under threat, the affordable rehearsal space for musicians in Toronto right now. And then what brings us here is protecting music venues from rapid rent and real estate market changes, the idea of cultural land trusts. So we talked about this sort of really at a high level and very much introductory for the music community, because CLTs, community land trusts, are really probably not that well known, or still a very new concept within the live music sector and industry. Live music is very much traditionally a very lone wolf dominated sector. There's often not a lot of long-term thinking, and this is no disrespect to the amazing, passionate business owners who run live music venues, but most of the people are people who wanted to open a bar, who love music, who saw an opportunity to support the local music scene, but maybe it was very sort of opportunity-based. A place came up, they rented it out, they put together a business plan, and they're sort of, often their business plan or their mission statement was simply to exist. So the idea of creating a community land trust does involve a lot more long-term thinking, planning, community collaboration, and trust building. And so it's something that's why I think that's one of the reasons why it's still very new and nascent within music. I'm myself not currently starting in a CLT, but I'm very intrigued by the idea. Within our study, we sort of outline for the sort of more lay reader or more general music industry audience how CLTs work. There's a few case studies that Erika outlined much better than I can. Cast being one in the San Francisco Bay Area. They own a few buildings, some of which have a live music or performance component, including Counterpulse and 447 Minna. We mentioned the Creative Trust in the UK. Another sort of CLT adjacent organization is the Music Venue Trust that was established in 2014 by a venue owner called Mark David, who really wanted to start a national trust for grassroots music venues. And they've really established what they call a grassroots music venue, which is a space under 300 capacity, which is sort of run programmed with the aim of supporting emerging music and emerging music artists. And then sort of when they launched, they had this idea of community ownership being an end goal, but when they started, they were really focused on trying to stabilize the sector because something like 35% of the grassroots music venues closed in the UK between 2006 and 2016. And then just by the time 2020 rolled around, they'd done a really good job of stabilizing the sector. There was more new venues opening than closing. And then the pandemic happened and that sort of scuppered the whole thing. This is what the term they used. But during the pandemic, they launched Music Venue Properties, which was a community benefit society. So the public can buy shares. They had a sort of crowdfunding facing campaign called Own Our Venues. The public could buy shares and receive voting privileges, and I think something like 3% APR. The aim was to raise £3.5 million to buy 9 grassroots music venues around the United Kingdom. And the idea was that these are places that were already operating as grassroots music venues, and then the owner was open to selling. So the idea was that rather than them selling it off to someone who might open a coffee shop or a furniture warehouse, they would sell it to this trust. And they just bought their first venue called The Snug, which is in Atherton in Greater Manchester. So we conclude the study with a range of policy recommendations, like some of which are based around creating more sort of up-to-date and accurate data for live music, others around encouraging municipalities to take on the stage truck as a municipal program, examining new federal funding models for live music, because there was all this amazing funding that came out during the pandemic and is now going away. And the upcoming years for performing arts presentation and live music presentation are looking a little grim. And one idea was to create a new provincial charitable organization, something that could sort of become an alternative funding model for some of these creative ideas, including a community land trust or cultural land trust. I call it the Ontario Space for Music Foundation. The idea of it could potentially fund a network of spaces that could support more diverse emerging musical artists. Because let's face it, it's the high art institutions, the symphonies and the ballets that all have fundraising departments, and there's really no equivalent for artists, for presenters that support hip hop or indie music or electronic music. And then really sort of tying this all together under sort of the bigger banner, an exciting banner of Cultural Renaissance 2.0. 25 years ago, we had the Cultural Renaissance 1.0, where there was all this provincial investment in new shiny buildings for arts and culture, like the new Agilo, the ROM, TIFF, and the new OCAD building, for example, the Canadian Opera Company. The idea of this Cultural Renaissance 2.0 is it could be maybe more focused on adaptive reuse of a network of smaller buildings that support more edgy, emerging, more diverse talent, and sort of bringing this together under this sort of new banner that really gets people excited. So you can call up the QR code. Please download the study at wavelengthmusic.ca, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. The specificity around DIY, music space, and then each art form, I think is something that keeps coming up, like what a theater needs versus what a dance space needs versus, all these different types of spaces need different types of things. But Anyway, I'm aware that we are very close to time because we all talked a little longer than we thought, which is, it happens. So I kind of want to just turn it over to questions because there are people here who know things and can share. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah, microphone, thank you.
Hello, that's better. I'm a musician, but I guess this is like maybe to flag for folks. I really love that last presentation because it spoke to me. Flag for folks, or maybe ask if any of you have considered the issues around visual artists in live workspaces and the materials that they use being potentially. I think it's more so a thing than other kinds of arts, and like what kind of solutions do you have for that? Because living in places where visual arts are being created can be quite dangerous.
HVAC. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah, I can address that because every discipline has its own unique needs. With music, it's sound. With visual arts, it's air. With dance, it's the movement. And like if you're in 401 Richmond and you're dancing on that floor, everyone below you can hear, and the room reverberates. So there's there's the physical ramifications there, and then people with disabilities needing I need a space that's accessible, not just to make the art, but also to get into the space. So there are all kinds of concerns, and the problem is our funding envelopes are so industry specific. And the knowledge and expertise is also very discipline specific. So musicians will know what they need, but visual artists will know, but not understand what musicians need. And we can't have a land trust just for music and just for visual arts. I don't think we can. I don't think there's enough funding and capacity to do so. So we need to all understand these things. And for visual arts, yes, HVAC is really, really essential, but more than that. Because you need to deal with the toxic waste and disposal of paint supplies and paint thinners, and so there's quite a lot that you need a muck-up space, right? And we're not building like live workspaces. Artscape was pretty good, but really the spaces aren't that great they're good for a certain kind of disciplines, but not for others, and it's really, really hard to build out spaces that are going to meet the needs. Visual arts is. The reality is that most disciplines, especially dance, is you have a home and you have a studio, and you just have to try to manage both. And so, probably the solution is to fund that, to have some funding envelopes to help arts workers afford a studio and a house until we can figure out how to be more customizable and to invest more in these live workspaces that can adapt.
Yeah, or maybe have not unlike what farmers are trying to do, have like adjacent affordable housing to a building that is specified for, rehearsing or creating art, so that you're close and they're all part of the same land trust, but you're not actually living and working in the same space. Sorry, I wasn't holding my mic. Bad form.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
While you're moving the microphone on to the next question, I just popped into my mind, it didn't end up happening, but the lawyer Andreas Kologianidis was actually working on a co-op for the Regent Park, and it was a musicians co-op, and it had live space in the upper floors, and then recording studios and performance spaces in the lower. And so that's the kind of thing that we need, right? So we would need a visual arts place where there's a gallery in the lower floor, and that's what we have in the Triangle Lofts where I live. Is there's the commercial gallery on the main floor, but let it be for the residents, and not just for a gallery. Like have it be a performance space. Let's have some sound poetry there. Like let's do all kinds of different things, and then have work studios as well as homes in the same property. So end of thought.
Thanks, Jessa.
Hi, sorry, my name's Arella. I'm a part of the same land trust as Hannah. I'm on the board there. But I just wanted to address the concern about live workspaces, because there were buildings on the west side of Dufferin at 440 Dufferin that were originally planned to be live workspaces. They took away what we call dirty spaces because it was glass blowers and woodworkers and all that. We were promised space in the new building, and at the 11th hour before a councillor left, that building got sold back to the developer for an astonishingly low amount of money. So we need to figure out how we can hold people to account. We also have to think about how we can use places that are being used for one thing during the day and another thing in the evenings. We need to find a way that we can have, like, I don't know, pop-up spaces in, like if a building is going to be torn down in 10 years, can we use that space alternately while we're trying to figure it out? And our Cultural Spaces Land Trust, we're focused in our area and we're trying to figure out all the different arts organizations. But I think it's important to consider that we have to all the music center, the music sector, the arts sector, we all have to figure out a way to work together, because we can have an art show in a same place where someone rehearses at night if it works out, or we need to figure out ways to collaborate. The other thing that I think is important is we get these art spaces, and for example, Barbara Astman wrote an article in the Globe about a really interesting situation she found herself in, where she was renting studio space at one of the Artscape buildings, and she was being forced to pay whatever is the highest rent for highest hydro rates, because it was seen as a commercial space. And we need to find a way that we can make these spaces affordable for arts communities of all sorts. So I just wanted to put out a couple more thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you for that, and thank you for all your advocacy and your work. Really appreciate it. I think you've made a really good point too, that there is a gap in the kind of like artist live work zoning, because artist live workspace is not protected by residential tenancy, by the Residential Tenancy Act in Ontario. You can evict artists from live work. There's no requirement to replace. It's a really important policy gap. I want to just very briefly acknowledge Kayla McGee. I thought you'd be shocked. So Kayla's here from the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, Heritage, and we're sort of like just started having these conversations earlier today about eligibility for cultural land trusts, the potential to incubate cultural land trusts from arts organizations who are eligible for heritage, because they may not be eligible if they're just starting as a CLT or if they're being incubated from a CLT. So anyway, is there anything do you wanna, or should we just, you wanna, be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I actually work in two different programs. So I work in the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, who has provided some incubation money to two of the organizations on the stage, for better or for worse. And I also work in the multiculturalism program, also known as CS MARI. It's like an anti-racism, multiculturalism, inclusion sort of program. So if you're thinking about a cultural land trust, there is the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund. We have like a feasibility study component where if you need to do things like needs assessments, et cetera, there could be support there. But there's also, in the multiculturalism program, it's just sort of percolating in my mind. There are capacity building, there's a capacity building component in there. And so I think that if organizations that were working either in arts or in housing, or perhaps both, might be able to access capacity building funding through that program if it was centered in things like racial justice, Indigenous land back, reconciliation, like all of these things, these themes that keep coming up. And so there might be an opportunity there. So I'll be around for like a little bit after this. If anyone has ideas, I can scribble my email address later. Yeah?
Amazing. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Anybody else? Did you have a question for here?
Thanks, guys, for a great panel. I'm aware that right now in the city of Toronto, and maybe a little bit less familiar with BC or Montreal, but there's a lot of different secondary plans right now going on, and a lot of different studies that tap into directly or in a kind of multi-layered way cultural spaces. One of them, cultural districts plan, and the nightlife studies that are going on right now. And I was just wondering, in this moment where the city is taking on, a somewhat slow process of studying these spaces, if there are ways that you see strong synergies and ways to tap into this moment with the city to actually push forward like specific policy and ways that we can, synergize our activism in these moments where there's a slight forum going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I think at least in Vancouver, the studies that we've read say that if possible, try to get yourself involved with not the arts department. It sounds like your main allies. It should be the arts, particularly at the city, but it's actually infrastructure, engineering, real estate, planning, where most of the decisions get made. So there's 7,000 employees in the city of Vancouver, only 40 or so are involved in culture in some way. So I would say being involved, also recognizing that there's housing and also childcare needs in the city that are kind of above arts and culture needs, but we intersect with them. I had to fight hard to get my child into childcare, and we're also involved in artist housing, which is a kind of subset of housing. And so now actually that's become one way of addressing exactly what's being talked about with the live-work situation, which is you have housing and then you have some kind of shared space. So we have the 30 units of housing with a 4,000 square foot production space on the ground floor. And we're still trying to figure out exactly how it'll work. But I would say the city of Vancouver is fairly progressive in the sense they have regulation in place for the safety issues that you're talking about. They have a Class A, which is less hazardous type practices, and they have Class B, more hazardous. So whenever any new buildings are built, they have to conform to those codes, and it provides all of those same standards as industrial expectation of hazardousness. So slop sinks with sediment traps and HVAC systems and hood vents and that type of thing. So it's all there. It's not actually that hard in terms of the science. I would say the big issue for us with live work is more on the financial exposures around property tax and also in terms of who is the right party to arbitrate whether or not it's an artist. That became a big issue in Vancouver in the 90s and 2000s. They had a whole bunch of live work space. They all got turned over. Now it's all like literally lawyers and doctors. Sorry to lawyers and doctors in here, but you took over the art space and maybe more creative practices that generated a bigger income because they're not protected anyway. They're market. And so for us, we've actually mostly moved away from live work, although there is more and more discussion about how to make it work, just because we find people actually need additional space, and sometimes the regulations isn't there yet to really protect the folks in there. So, yeah, that'd be my...
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just it's a great question, and part of our study is we actually looked at all the other studies that had come before us because we didn't want to just make another study. There are something like 14 music industry studies in Ontario in the last 9 years. And not just in Toronto, but also in London, Hamilton, Ottawa, various music strategies. Especially in Toronto, there's been really great studies into the importance of DIY spaces and the importance of supporting emerging entertainment areas outside the downtown core. But one thing Dan Silver did, because he's sort of like a human ChatGPT, is he spent a whole weekend analyzing all the studies and comparing all the different recommendations and laying them out and coming up with all the shared recommendations. And you did see a lot of these similar ideas kept getting repeated over and over again in these studies. A big one is utilize underused spaces for live music. So there'd be often a lot of great ideas and recommendation, but not much in the way of evaluation or implementation. So that leads to one of our policy recommendations, is creating more of a mechanism to actually evaluate the success of these various reports and recommendations that we often hear a lot. But to bring it to a positive point, in the city of Toronto, there is one really great example of the city really following through on some of these recommendations is the city music office, led by Mike Tanner and Jacqueline Tam, helped open a space on Queen Street called the It's Okay Studio, which is a former shoe store on Queen West. There's a city-owned building that they were able to basically give to a black-led collective called It's Okay, who had been doing events in sort of strange, unconventional spaces. Like their first show was famously in a boxing gym. But they were given the opportunity to, I don't know the exact details of their arrangement, but very below market rent for them to take over this space, a two-story space that can be used for live music, but also used for visual art and co-working and film shoots, photography, that sort of thing. And that's a really it's one really great example. And I think that many people in the music community are hoping it might be a template for the future for other nonprofit organizations to be able to access city-owned space for presentation and other forms of artistic production. Another example, actually, that I neglected to mention during my presentation is Hughes Room, which is a venue. It was a folk club that opened in the early 2000s on Dundas West, out by Bloor and Dundas. And when it opened, it was very much not an area where you would see much live music happening. And they became a success. And they have a very much older, wealthier demographic, and which does sort of explain why they were able to do what they did. But they were evicted, I believe, during the early months of the pandemic. Like they already sort of were in trouble. I think they had been sort of evicted at some point a few years earlier, and then managed to have a reprieve, a lease on life. But after they lost their space on Dundas for good, they actually decided to reconstitute themselves as a charitable organization. Previously, they were a for-profit business. Now they're a charity, and with a big range of cultural support, they were sort of community support rather from their wealthier, older demographic. They were able to raise enough funds to buy a church on Broadview, at 296 Broadview, a church that was on sale. I believe they had some support from Cultural Spaces Canada Fund. Kayla can probably confirm that. No, they did not. Okay, interesting conversation. But I think that what's interesting is, like, the question does arise: is Hughes Room a cultural land trust? So it's an interesting question to think about. So I wanted to mention that, and then the last thing I wanted to say is, like, in terms of that, we talked about the sort of specificity of different arts disciplines, and for music, yes, sound is huge, like the ability to make noise, but also space. A good concert venue requires a footprint, requires a large land and square footage in order to have decent gathering space and good acoustics. So maybe potentially there is a future in churches.
That's a perfect note to end on. Those two amazing examples of things that actually did not fall apart, and then spaces that actually are born and seeing people. So thank you. That's great.
Thanks. I think there is one more question down.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it. And then I want you to eat.
Are we out of time?
Oh, sorry. You need a mic.
Hi. It's nice to hear from everyone in this room. So I'm a cultural planner and visual artist, and I've worked with Johnny in the past and working with Hannah now, perhaps a collaboration with Jessa soon. And I've also heard a lot about your work and Brian's work. I'm from Vancouver. So I've been thinking a lot about multidisciplinary spaces for culture and arts. And I thought it was really interesting that at the beginning you had distinguished arts from culture. Art spaces from cultural spaces, or I don't know if that was necessarily what you said, but in some form or way. I'm wondering, I've been thinking a lot about these community spaces for gathering, for music, dance, celebration, performance. And I'm also thinking about banquet halls and other spaces that are unconventionally celebrating culture in the form of rituals and traditions, and that also does include the arts in terms of music and celebration and dance, right? And people coming together to, be together. And that's what a lot of the arts and music venues are kind of about. It's just a different type of celebration, maybe. So I guess what I'm wondering is how do you define a cultural space?
I can start maybe. This word trust, when we think of cultural land trust, it's huge because there's, unlike housing, where of course there's community interest long term, but in the day to day, it's the individuals, it's at the family level where you're building that trust, right? And they're benefiting. But when you're trying to put a public facing space like a performance hall or a gallery into a trust, what does that mean? Like the accountability, the involvement, the benefits are not just individuals and families, it's the entire community, it's the neighborhood that it belongs to. And there's that engagement and questions about trust. When it is living in a trust, what does that mean? There's the organization, of course, the arts organizations and the artists that are sharing their work in that space, but what does the trust mean to, I don't think we've answered that question yet. I don't think we know. What does the trust then mean to the patrons, the audience members, the donors and funders that are a part of the community around that space? I think there are lots of unanswered questions about that, and I'm really looking forward to diving into them. Like, I think about it every day, but we don't have easy answers to them. Yeah, and there's going to be differences per discipline. There's going to be differences per community, like the disability community, the Indigenous community, the Black community might think quite differently about what trust means and the level of accountability and transparency and care that's going to be anticipated as the minimum before you even start having conversations about establishing a trust are going to be different. As a white settler, I am trying not to do what white people normally do and not move forward without that deep level of trust in the community first. But that's not always something that's going to be taken in the same way in different communities. So I think we have to answer, what are all the levels of trust that are needed? Like there's accountability and transparency and respect and reciprocity and love and care, and then from all of those steps, then you can have trust, and then you're ready to have the physical building. But there's years and years of work, really, that's required to get to that point, I think.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to let you go and eat food. We could talk to you all day. If anyone is interested, CNCLT members, we'd really like to start like a regular culture space kind of subgroup that maybe every couple months we just like talk about ideas. So if anyone's interested, hit us up. Thank you so much, all of you, for agreeing to come and do this today. And thanks to CNCLT, and thanks to our tech. Couldn't have done it without you. Thanks for CNCLT for agreeing to let us have this space and time. I know we're a small group, but hopefully we can kind of get our agenda forward. Thanks so much, everybody.